Growing up, I loved this commandment, believe it or not. The fourth commandment was probably my favorite commandment growing up. I grew up in a Christian home, and my parents took this commandment seriously. Other than having to endure going to church every Sunday, which was terribly boring to me, the rules that my parents had for Sundays were relieving to me. Super relieving to me. We didn't have to do yard work. I grew up, as you know, in the middle of 7 children, which means I grew up in a big house. We had to have a big house with a big yard just to house all of us rugrats. And Saturdays were yard work days. And while all of my friends were getting up and going to the beach or whatever it was they were doing, my mom was waking us up at 8:30 in the morning or so on Saturday, mind you, and putting us to work in the yard. She reasoned, I think rightly, but hurtfully to us, she reasoned that I have 5 strong, able-bodied boys. I am not going to hire a lawn service to take care of the 2 acres that we lived on. So we did yard work all day Saturday for the most part. I hated Saturdays. I couldn't wait, actually, to go back to school the following week. But Sunday was different. Sundays, we didn't have to do yard work. We weren't allowed to do homework on Sunday, which was, music to my ears. It was unbelievably relieving that we weren't allowed to do homework. We spent Sundays at home as a family together after church. We watched football. We played football. The day felt different. It was more relaxed. There was less pressure to get things done. No one ever explained to me the reason why Sunday felt so different and the reason why Sunday was in fact a different kind of day other than the fact that we went to church. But I liked it. It was relieving. So after I became a Christian and got married and started having children, I wanted Sundays in my home to feel like Sundays growing up for me. And so I started making some rules and doing my best to force my family to abide by those rules. Okay, I wanted their experience to be the same as my experience. I wanted Sundays to be a family day, a day of rest and relaxation where we not only didn't do work, but we weren't allowed to do any work. And of course, I decided what work was on that particular day. My rules, however, became less about resting and relief and more about rigid obedience. So I was the enforcer. I was, as Kim would say, the Gestapo. I was the one who was going to ensure that the Tchividjian family observed the Sabbath day and kept it holy. And I had my list of rules and regulations regarding what I thought that looked like. And it wasn't long before Sundays became the least favorite day in our home because everybody felt shackled to the rules that I had made. Kim was telling me this morning that she wanted me to expose myself a little bit and talk in more detail about some of those rules that I imposed and enforced. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that because you would lose complete and total respect for me entirely. And I don't want to run that risk. I know God's love for me is unconditional, but I'm not so sure that yours is, so I'm not going to expose myself in such an embarrassing way. But this was my problem. In seeking to honor the substance of the fourth commandment, I was violating the spirit of it. Because in a sense, this is intended to be a gift, and I felt like it was a gift in my house growing up. It felt like a day of freedom, not a day of forced compliance to a list of rules and regulations. In my house, not the one growing up, but with my wife and kids, a day that was intended to be restful and relieving and refreshing quickly turned into a day of scorekeeping and scowls and oppression. It was a legalistic atmosphere. See, my problem was this. I was mistaken to think that keeping this commandment was as simple as not doing any work on Sundays. staying away from certain activities and engaging in others. And if I could do that, if I could make sure that I and my family stayed away from certain activities and engaged in other activities, then we were keeping the Sabbath holy. But the demand of this commandment is actually much deeper than that, much deeper. It actually requires something much, much more than just engaging in certain activities and refusing to engage in other activities. It's not that simple. It's not that easy to keep. If it was that easy to keep, then I would guess that at least half of this room could keep this commandment and keep it well. If we were just serious and rigid about our compliance to not engaging in certain things and engaging in other things. But the fact of the matter is, this commandment demands much more. It requires something much deeper than this. You see, like all of the other commandments, this commandment exposes us. And this is really, in a sense, what the Ten Commandments are intended to do. They are intended to expose us. I mentioned a number of weeks ago the rich young ruler who approached Jesus and said, "What must I do to inherit the kingdom of God?" And Jesus made his way through all of the Ten Commandments. And in his somewhat shockingly audacious way, he claimed to Jesus that he had kept all of these commandments since the time he was a boy. And I think some of us feel that way as well. If we grew up in church, if we have grown up and never really done anything that bad, if we've we know we're sinners theoretically, we believe that we're sinners in a theoretical sense, but when it really comes down to it, for those who may have grown up going to church, grown up in a Christian home, grown up perhaps even going to Christian schools, we have concluded that we have pretty much, even though we haven't done it perfectly in theory, that we've been able to, for the most part, stay away from the bad stuff. And we may have not kept these commandments perfectly, but we've done pretty well. At least we've done better than the guy sitting next to us. And that was the posture of the rich young ruler. And that is what I call a cheapened interpretation of the law, as you've heard me talk about before. To simply conclude that, like I said last week, that to not take the Lord's name in vain is to say, "Oh gosh," instead of "Oh God," and to never say Jesus Christ in an irreverent way. If we can just do that, we're keeping this commandment, is to cheapen the law. And also to conclude that to keep this commandment, the fourth commandment, all we have to do is avoid certain activities and engage in other activities and make sure we keep those rules. That too is a cheapening of the law. This command demands something much deeper, much more profound than that. And it exposes us when we understand what God is intending to do in and through this command for us and to us specifically. It exposes us. Like all the other commandments, it exposes us. And this one exposes the workaholic in all of us. Now listen, when we hear the word workaholic, we typically think of the corporate suit who spends 90 hours a week at the office. We think of someone who can't enjoy any other facet of life because they're so obsessed by their careers. And since that may not describe us, we think we're not guilty of workaholism. But workaholism is something much more profound than that. It's something much more far-reaching than that. And believe it or not, it affects every single one of us, you and I, regardless of your age. You could be 10 years old or you could be 85 years old. You are a workaholic by nature. I am a workaholic by nature. You see, ever since Genesis chapter 3, workaholism has marked the human race. Ever since Adam and Eve decided perfectly for all of us that they would pull this off on their own, that they would generate independence from God, and that they would make it by themselves, we have been marked by workaholism. As I've said before, while you may not be guilty of believing justification by works theologically, all of us are guilty of believing justification by works functionally. So we might say, okay, We don't believe in justification by works, which is this errant theological doctrine that basically says, if at the end of my days, my good works outweigh my bad works, then God will accept me, and God will love me, and God will approve of me. So all I have to do is live my life in such a way where the scales weigh more heavily on my good works than they do my bad works. And since God judges according to our scale, then if we can accomplish that, then God will love us and God will approve of us, and we can justify ourselves by what we do and by who we can become. Well, lots of people, perhaps most people here, don't believe that, okay? We believe that it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this not of yourselves. It is the gift of God so that no man can boast, okay? Ephesians chapter 2. We believe that. But that doesn't then mean that we don't functionally believe in justification by works. We may not adhere to justification by works as a doctrine, believing that it's errant and wrong and unbiblical, but at a functional level, we can't escape the allure of justification by works. You see, life requires, think about this for a minute, life requires so many things from us: a successful career, a stable marriage, well-behaved and emotionally adjusted children, a good reputation, a certain quality of life. We do our best to do better, to do more, and to do now. I mean, the pressure to make it happen by working harder and by working smarter wears us out. And we feel that weight. We feel that pressure. We all live with long lists of things to accomplish and people to please and situations to manage. We all live with those lists. We live according to justification by works. We feel this pressure. We feel like we have to make it happen. We feel like we have to get it done. And this pressure makes us performance addicts. People who conclude that our identity and our value are directly tied to our performance. So how I look, how intelligent I am, how my kids turn out, what people think of me becomes synonymous with my worth, becomes the anchoring of my identity. We don't even typically realize that this is happening. We're not necessarily conscious of the fact that this is the way we approach life each and every day, but it is, and it has been ever since Genesis chapter 3. To us performance addicts, success equals life and failure equals death. And you know that to be true. When you fail to accomplish something that you have hoped to accomplish, it feels like death. When your kids don't turn out the way that you had hoped they would turn out, it feels like death. When your job doesn't pan out the way that you hoped it would pan out, it feels like death. When you find yourself in your 60s, maybe your 70s, and you realize that you haven't put away the kind of money that you should have put away, and you're experiencing financial distress and stress, you feel like it's a death. But when you succeed, when something goes well, when your kids do turn out the way that you hope they turn out, when you do experience success in the workplace or your relationships are going well, it feels like life. To us performance addicts, and every single one of us is, success equals life. Failure equals death. We all feel the stress to secure a sense of significance, to be accepted, to be validated, loved. And we conclude that if we're going to experience these things, we have to make it happen. We have to make this happen for ourselves. We cannot depend on someone else or something else to make this happen. We have to make it happen. And we feel this weight. We feel this pressure. In other words, workaholism is the attempt to save ourselves by generating our own importance, our own meaning, our own worth by what we do and by who we can become. We become workaholics when it comes to our profession. We become workaholics when it comes to our church. We become workaholics when it comes to our relationships because we're desperately trying to win the approval and the affection of God, of other people, of ourselves. feeling like if we don't win the approval and the affection and the acceptance of God and others and ourselves, then we won't be justified. Our life won't be validated. We feel the burden to make it, to get it done, to impress, to earn, to prove ourselves, to improve ourselves, to succeed. Why? Because our very identity is at stake. We are workaholics, every single one of us, at a pretty deep and not so subtle level. So when we look at the command to rest in this light, we discover that we're all guilty. And to keep this commandment by simply on one day of the week avoiding certain activities and engaging in others is to cheapen the law, to make it doable, to make the bar low enough that we can jump over. And as a result of coming to that conclusion, we don't feel desperate. We feel, in a sense, even though we might not say it like the rich young ruler, at least in that moment, but I do this. I keep this one. I mean, surely, God, here's my resume, you can see. I mean, having grown up in a Christian home, I have, in a sense, kept this my entire life. I hear my voice as the rich young ruler speaking to Jesus. I've done this. I've kept it. But because we are all by nature workaholics, because we are all performance addicts, because we are, in a sense, irresistibly drawn to justification by works, we find ourselves guilty of violating this commandment, because the irony is this commandment commands rest. Rest. This commandment commands that we rest fully and finally because of the work that God has done on our behalf. That we rest trusting that God has done everything we could never do on our behalf. We rest in our dependence on God. We rest in the fact, or we're called to rest in the fact, that all of our meaning and all of our worth and all of our significance and all of those things are ultimately anchored in God's love for us and His calling us to Himself and placing us in His family and those sorts of things, that we are dependent on Him for our livelihood. We're dependent on Him for the very breath that we take. We can now rest because this whole thing is riding on God and His strength, not us and our strength. And that just becomes, in a sense, repulsive to us. I was in New York this past week speaking at the King's College, and I mentioned something to the students what I have mentioned to you on numerous occasions, and that is something that one of my professors in seminary said to me a number of years ago. He said, if you want to make people mad, preach the law. If you want to make people irate, preach grace. And his reason for saying that is because the law tells us what to do. We don't like the law because it tells us what to do. But grace offends us even more because it tells us that there's nothing we can do. And if there is one thing that we hate more than being told what to do, it's being told that there's nothing we can do. And so here is this command where it almost feels like, if you understand it rightly, it almost feels like the flesh is being ripped off of your bones, because it's saying, rest, do nothing. It's already been done. Relax, rest. You don't have to work to validate yourself and to justify your existence. You don't have to generate your own worth and your own value and secure for yourself a sure and certain identity based on what you do and who you can become. Rest. And that's just impossible for people like you and me, for sinners like you and me. So when we understand that we are all natural do-it-yourselfers, then we understand that we're guilty of violating this commandment perpetually. Not just on Sundays, but perpetually. We're guilty. We are workaholics. We want the kind of rest that comes from knowing we're loved and accepted, but we make the mistake of concluding that we have to work to get it. And as a result, life becomes heavier. But Jesus offers a freer way. He offers a lighter way, a more liberating path. I was reading a fantastic book this past week that I'm not finished with yet by Brennan Manning, who some of you may know. Brennan Manning wrote lots of books. He is now dead, but he was a lifelong alcoholic and struggled, to the point not just where he would go home after work and drink himself to sleep, but he would go on these binges whereby he would end up homeless for 6-8 months at a time sometimes, living on the street. This sophisticated, well-educated man, married, divorced. He started off as a Roman Catholic priest, fell in love with a woman, left the priesthood to marry this woman, ended up getting divorced. If you read his autobiography, which is entitled All Is Grace, it's just a tragic story. Really, almost from the time he came into this world, his life was nothing but a tragedy. I was reading that book on an airplane about 3 years ago actually, and made my way through the first 4 chapters of his autobiography and had to put the book down. It was so depressing. But he produced some of the most amazing sentences, some of the most amazing paragraphs on the grace of God because he was so in touch with his desperate need for it. I've said it before, I've learned more about grace from addicts and prisoners than I have from most theologians. Because those people know how desperately they need it. They haven't just talked about it and theorized about it. They have felt their need for it, and as a result, produced a depth of understanding that has, in many ways, blessed me and set me free. While I was reading one of Brennan Manning's books this past week entitled Abba's Child, and he said this, which, now I've just given you 2 book recommendations, okay? So write them down. All Is Grace, which is a tough read, I'm telling you. All Is Grace by Brennan Manning, his autobiography, and then Abba's Child. And listen, just like any book you read except for the Bible, because every human author is fallen and imperfect and sinful and all of those things. If you're gonna be a reader, you have to be able to develop the skill of chewing off the meat and spitting out the bones. Okay, because there is nothing, I go back and read stuff that I've written myself, okay, in my own books, and I have to chew off the meat and spit out the bones. Okay, because it's not the Bible. Only the Bible is the only book where you don't have to spit out any bones when you read them. So don't go read these books and go, "What? There was a sentence on page 52 that I didn't agree with. Pastor Tullian, are you a heretic?" Okay, if you don't agree with it, I probably don't agree with it. Okay, I'm not telling you read it like it's an infallible book, but those 2 books are heart-wrenching and gripping in a remarkable way. But his book, Abba's Child, that I've been reading this past week, he says this, and it was very telling and profound, and it spoke to me because it spoke to my own experiential struggles. He said, losing our illusions is difficult because illusions are the stuff that we live by. Losing our illusions about ourselves. Becoming detoxed from our delusions about ourselves is very, very painful. It's very difficult because illusions are the stuff we live by. We desperately want to believe about ourselves that we're not as bad as the rapist and the murderer and the adulterer. We want to believe that we are not as bad. We build our lives around an illusion of law-keeping, of goodness, that in the light of God's true law reveal to us who we really are. The law really is, in a sense, like a mirror. It shows us who we really are. And it shows us what we really, really need. And so Jesus here offers a freer way, not the way of justification by works, whereby we can gain a little bit of God's love and favor, and we can experience God's love and favor to a deeper degree if we just stay away from certain activities on Sunday and engage in other activities on Sunday. I mean, this is how arbitrary it is, okay? So, in my home growing up, watching football was not against the rules because it was restful. We sat around as a family, at least the guys did, sat around as a family, we watched the game. I mean, it was like bona fide good family time. Okay, and I know there's probably not a woman in this room who thinks that sitting around watching a football game and screaming and those sorts of things is bona fide family time, but you just don't understand, okay? That is our love language, all right? And so we were allowed to do that growing up, and we were allowed to go outside and play. I had friends whose parents wouldn't even let them go outside on Sunday. Okay, they weren't allowed to watch TV on Sunday. They weren't allowed to watch football on Sunday. They weren't allowed to throw a ball on Sunday, because throwing a ball is, work. And they weren't allowed to do that. They would go to church in the morning, they would go back to church in the evening, and they would basically, pray the rest of the day in between church services. I don't know. But in my home, that stuff, it wasn't a legalistic environment growing up. It was, it was enjoyable, like I said. But the variation of rules and regulations was so arbitrary. Like I said, in my friend's family, he wasn't even allowed to go outside. Okay, I mean, they would literally unplug the phone on Sunday morning or on Sundays, because if the phone rang and someone answered it, that was work, okay? So arbitrary. My home wasn't like that, didn't feel like that, but we do these things. And as silly as that sounds, we do these things so that we can convince ourselves that we're pulling it off. We're doing it. And Jesus says, if you could do it, if you were capable of pulling this off, then I'm unnecessary, irrelevant. Then you don't need me and the work that I came to do for you. You're not capable of pulling this off. You're not capable of earning God's love and favor and forgiveness by being good. You're not that good. In fact, you're a lot worse than you think you are. And that's why I've come to do for you what you could never do for yourself. You see, the sin underneath all sins, said Martin Luther, is the lie that we cannot trust the love and grace of Jesus, and that we must therefore take matters into our own hands. That's a pretty profound statement. The sin underneath all sins is the lie that we cannot trust the love and grace of Jesus, and we therefore must take matters into our own hands. And so we do. We do. We're control freaks. We're micromanagers. We have to manage ourselves. We have to manage others. We have to manage our reputation. We have to manage the circumstances in our life. We are allergic to rest. Allergic to it. It's in a sense repulsive to us. See, but in Matthew chapter 11, as Zach already spoke this morning, Matthew chapter 11, Jesus says, come to me. Think about this in light of the fourth commandment. What does Jesus say? Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. The greatest invitation ever given, ever. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. What he's saying, what Jesus is saying there is that none of our work will give us the rest that we long for. None of our work. None of our work. None of our work professionally, none of our work relationally, none of our work with our children, none of our work for ourselves, none of our work will grant us the peace of God which transcends all understanding and gives us rest. None of the work we do will give us the rest we long for. The rest we long for in the deepest parts of our being can only come as a result of Jesus' work for us, and that means that Jesus is our Sabbath rest. He is. This is a big mistake to read this and go, okay. And listen, I have great respect in some ways for the Puritans, okay? I mean, these were some pretty courageous people. But they tended to be pretty legalistic people too, especially when it came to stuff like this. I mean, there was a laundry list of things you were allowed to do and not allowed to do. And I always ask myself, when you find yourself developing a laundry list of things that aren't given to us specifically in the Bible, you know what that reveals? It reveals that we believe that if we can just come up with the right list and keep it, that we're pulling this off. In other words, it reveals that we suffer from what I call a high anthropology, where we actually believe that we are stronger than we are. See, a high anthropology, let me use some sort of sociological / theological language here. A high anthropology accompanies a low Christology. In other words, the higher you think of you and your ability, the lower you will think of Jesus and his ability. Whereas a high Christology always translates into a low anthropology. So you can tell me the deepest, darkest, grossest secrets of your life, and I won't be surprised. I expect you to be a total, categorical screw-up. I expect it. Okay? I don't think you're something great, because I know you, and I know you because I know me, and we're not that different. So I know that I have very, very low expectations for human beings, okay? Life is easier when you have zero expectations for human beings, all right? Just is. When you expect the person around you to let you down, when you expect that your expectations will never be met, when you expect that the person that's standing right next to you will one day turn his back or her back on you in a moment when you need him or her the most. I expect that stuff. Reading the Bible, living life, and doing it myself has taught me over the years that our expectations for, one another are way too high and out of reach. And so when I think about the way we typically read these commandments and our high opinion of ourselves, my high opinion of myself, which I explained in just growing up with my wife and kids, I mean, I had such a high opinion of myself that we could actually do this. And all we had to do was make sure that the laundry wasn't done on Sunday, that we didn't cook on Sunday, that we didn't do homework on Sunday. If we could just do those things, then we're pulling this off. But the law shows us something so much more demanding than that. And Jesus is saying, listen, none of your work will ever give you the rest that you long for. I am your Sabbath rest. When he shouted, "It is finished," from the cross, he was announcing that his work alone can free us from the slavery of having to rescue ourselves. When he shouted, "It is finished," from the cross, he was announcing that his work alone can free us from the pressure of having to make it on our own. That his work alone can relieve us of the burden that we feel to win, to get ahead, to be on top of everything. In Christ, there is no more work required for justification, validation. "It is finished" from the cross puts an end to all of our striving. And it says, rest. Rest. Everything that needed to be done was done. Now listen, it is finished doesn't mean we no longer work. Okay, don't hear me wrongly. Doesn't mean everyone goes home today, goes back to bed, and never gets up again until Jesus comes back, okay? That's not what it means, all right? That's not at all what it means. This is what it means. It means that from now on, we work from acceptance, not for it. What it means is that from now on, we work from love, not for it. We work from a position of security, not for a position of security. That's what it means. Doesn't mean we don't work at all. It just means that we work as free people. We work as people who have been set free, people who don't need a return on their investment because everything they need in Christ they already possess. And this brings huge relief and rest to our lives because now we can enjoy our work and our relationships without needing our work and needing our relationships to save us, which is how we typically approach our work and our relationships. We need these things to turn out well. We need these things to go our way because we're depending on these things to save us and to rescue us. We need our kids to turn out okay. We need people to think a certain way of us. We need our work and our profession to be deeply satisfying because we're depending on these things to save us, to rescue us. But when we understand that we now work not for acceptance, but from it. We now work not for love, but from it. We now work from a position of security and not for it. When we understand that, it sets us free. Now we can give ourselves to our relationships and give ourselves to our work and give ourselves to our hobbies and give ourselves to these things without needing these things to save us. So, once again, I'll close with this. Our deepest and truest identity is not built on what we do or who we know or what we can become. It's based on what Jesus has done for us. And the gospel promise is that the work is already done. And no advancement in this sense is necessary. That the work is done. Jesus has lived and died for us. Our sin has been given to him and his righteousness has been given to us. Before God, the righteousness of Jesus is all we have. Before God, the work of Jesus is all we have. Before God, the work of Jesus is all we need. So we who were once estranged have been declared reconciled. So let's stop trying so hard and enjoy resting at the feet of him who worked for us and hear him daily reminding us that he will never leave us, that he will never forsake us, that he is always with us, that because of his work, we can never ever outsin the coverage of God's forgiveness. We can never separate ourselves from God's love for us. It's impossible. That we are locked inside a cage of righteousness. We are clothed in an irremovable suit of forgiveness and pardon and absolution because of what Jesus has done. And once that grips our heart and we know how deeply we are loved and forgiven and accepted and approved, our work will feel so different. It'll feel so much more freeing. Our work with one another, our work in our relationships, our work professionally, whatever work is, it'll feel so much more freeing. Now we can love our kids without trying to fix them. We can love the people around us without trying to change them. We don't need the advancement in our career to feel like we matter because we're fully secure. We don't, as much as we enjoy our health, we don't need our health in order for us to feel like we're human. That because of what God in Christ has done for us, we're in forever. Everything we need and everything we long for in Christ we already possess. The keys are in your pocket.